Hello, and welcome to the first of what I hope is going to be many videos on Germany and World War I. My name is Jason Bieber. I am a military historian, PhD in World War I military history, and Imperial Germany and World War I is one of my favorite subjects, so I decided to give it a shot and have a series of long-form videos on World War I and Imperial Germany. So, the title of this video and the topic of this video is going to be, why did Germany lose in World War I? So they do in fact lose it, so I'm not trying to make any sort of revisionist statements here. But it is something that's really important to understand because there's a lot of misconceptions about it, and there's also a lot of detail that we have to look at. So I'll be looking at this from a strategic or operational and grand strategic worldview. And I'll also be looking at some other stuff that's going to be floating in there as well. We'll be looking at a bunch of different other, cultural and political topics that are going to be important to it. But suffice to say, I want to get a few things out of the way here. Number one, Germany was the best individual army in World War I. The other armies, while they were good, Germany on its own was the best army of the war, straight up. There's really no other way to put it. It in fact took multiple countries to ultimately defeat them, which I'll be talking about here. It also helped that Germany's allies just weren't that good. We'll be also talking about that as well. Now, while I say nobody can defeat Germany one-on-one, that's, if you put more than one country against Germany, then yeah, they can be defeated. So I just want to point out that the average German soldier was actually pretty good at their job. It also helped that Imperial Germany was a high trust society, where you had a large number of people who were very much, I don't want to say pro-military, but the military had a very positive influence in Germany for multiple reasons. It unified a lot of German areas. It made people see themselves not just as Germanic, but also German in the imperial sense. And the army itself was a prized position where people wanted to serve, and in fact volunteered. There was a large number of technical units, engineers, pioneers, and various railway workers and stuff like that. So there's a large number of people who served in various technical fields, and we started to see a very middle-class army, but the prestige of the army was really, really good. So towns and cities vied for the army units to be stationed there, and people wanted to serve because service in the military effectively guaranteed you at least a middle-class position in life. So in terms of social mobility, the German army was a very positive army. On top of it, it's also a pretty modern army, especially for 1914. And if you look at the photos over here, what we have is essentially an army that is ditching the 18th to 19th century. They're ditching the Frederick the Great era. They're ditching the Napoleonic era. They're even ditching the American Civil War and Franco-Prussian War era. So we have field gray or Feldgrau uniforms, which are designed to blend in more or less with the terrain around it. If you look at the sky behind it, you can see kind of fits with it, if you see what I mean by that. But number one, the uniforms were a lot more. They were nice. They were nice fitting. The uniforms were also pretty flexible, so you can see the legs and the trousers. They look pretty breathable. And again, these are also going to be industrially made. So we're going to be getting uniforms that are not only industrially made, but well made. And they can make a lot of them too. So we're looking at an army that's going to become a lot more industrial, and the Germans anticipated this. So you can also see the Germans are starting to move their way away from the early modern and early industrial period, where they had basically caps or hats essentially. So they're moving away from that. There's something like an early helmet, the Pickelhaube helmet. That's the one with the pointy hats over there. The Pickelhaube helmet it's fun, but it's also the beginning of a shift to protecting the head from shrapnel and bullets, mostly shrapnel, in that respect. And it's also designed to help protect the head from the elements as well, which is actually obviously really important too. Notice every soldier is wearing something like it, or in the picture in the snow. Yeah, there's reason for that. That being said, the Germans are starting to think about a modern war, and that's one of the reasons why they're so much better than some of the other armies that are out there. But first of all, they're the best individual army, so let's get that out of the way. Number two, no one really started World War I. It's an unexpected war, and pretty much all the major combatants had some value of creating it and value of starting it. I'm not really interested in getting into the whole arguments there, but the reality is that this isn't going to be about that. I'm not going to be talking about Germany's involvement in starting World War I or whatnot. And I'm looking more at how they fought in World War I and why they lost. So that's a separate argument. I'm not going to get into that here. But I will say this: World War I was unexpected. No one was actually anticipating war in 1914. I mean, there might be more Balkan conflicts. There was a 1912 and 1913 Balkan Wars, so they were kind of anticipating more problems in the Balkans. Obviously, we get that of Austria and Serbia, but that could have easily been its own Balkan War. So the reality is that no one was planning for war, and the Schlieffen Plan was the best unplanned option available. That's kind of how I look at the Schlieffen Plan. It was, and we're going to be talking about it in depth and in detail here, but the Schlieffen Plan was a stopgap. It was a stopgap plan, and it was also a political plan for additional resources and money. But that being said, it offered the Germans a way to go to war if it happened in 1914. And they're going to use it, and we'll explain why. And it's also important to note that the counterfactuals here are actually pretty interesting, because what happened in 1914 helps set the table, really, for a lot of stuff that's going to happen in the 20th and 21st century. So the winner of 1914, essentially, and then World War I entirely, gets to set the table for the century. And that's something really important, because what we do get is a world where there is another world war. We get a lot of different ideologies after both World War I and then World War II. But that being said, if Germany had won World War I, it could be argued that it would be better for the 20th century in some ways. First of all, the odds are we don't have communism, fascism, and almost assuredly we don't have the Holocaust. A few reasons for that. First of all, the Soviet version of communism just simply wouldn't exist. Soviet Union would not be created. Lenin would not win. None of that would happen. Fascism did exist, but it wasn't in control of anything, and it would not have been in Germany. There's no way, had Germany won World War I, the imperial throne would have shifted in any way, shape, or form appreciably. It just wouldn't happen. So, and obviously, along with that, with communism, fascism, there's also going to be no Holocaust. I mean, that's not to say Europe was philo-Semitic, pro-Jewish, but it is to say that anti-Semitism wouldn't have gone that way. So, no real communism, no real fascism, and the likelihood of no Holocaust. Now, anti-Semitism would still exist, old school anti-Semitism, and then also the modern eugenics-based anti-Semitism. Both would exist. However, the odds of it creating something like the Holocaust are slim. Now, syndicalism, which is an offshoot of communism, could have happened, but that's neither here nor there. Now, a few things I would point out that probably would exist if Germany won World War I is imperialism. Imperialism is destroyed because of both world wars. The European powers realize that they can't keep really putting money into imperialism, and they have to put money into their own home countries. We also get welfare economies that show up during and after World War I and World War II. And divesting Europe from empire allowed them to fund some of that. So, but if Germany wins World War I, none of that happens, and imperialism probably lasts longer. And then on top of that, republicanism, which is elected representative democracy, that's republicanism. Republicanism and monarchism would exist uncomfortably. We would probably see, obviously the survivability and the viability, in fact, of constitutional monarchies. But at the same point, it would still be an uneasy dance for both sides. It really would. Because republicanism and monarchism wouldn't necessarily be friends with each other at long term. but they would exist, and there would be no reason for constitutional monarchs not to continue, especially in Europe. Yep. So let's move along and look at the army that we're going to have in 1914. I've already mentioned a little bit about the soldiers, but I want to talk about the Schlieffen Plan. Now, the reasoning why in Germany in the early 1900s, the Schlieffen Plan was designed in 1940 and 1906. It's going to be subsequently updated after 1906, all the way through the World War I. Now, a few reasons why the Germans are going to invade France using the Schlieffen Plan. The simple reality is, if you look at the bottom map here, Germany is potentially faced with a war against both Russia and France. Now, in a war between Russia and France, the Germans really don't have defensible borders. On top of that, the Germans don't want to be in a position where they have to expend massive resources just holding on. Especially with the Russians are going to use and waste manpower, while the French can use industrialization to really push their way forward. And the Germans, they also have alliances. So the Germans do have allies. We'll be going back to this map later. But Germany is allied with Austria. We'll talk about whether or not Italy's in there. So the reality of the German alliance here is that the Germans don't know if they can really rely on the Austrians to do much. Realistically, you don't want to have to rely on other people to do the job for you. So the German plan is this: take out France first, and then shift to take out Russia. Now, the Russians, historically speaking, and this is the German High Command thought about this going into World War I. The Germans thought about how the Russians could, in the past, treat space for time. So in other words, they would lose territory, but use the time that would take the enemy to either A, move forward or consolidate the territory. They use that time to rebuild their army and then push forward once the enemy had overextended themselves. This happened in the Great Northern War with Sweden. This happened in the Napoleonic Wars. The Germans didn't want that to happen. So the only place where space and time would matter is France. Now, the Germans are smart. They don't want to hit the French border from Luxembourg to Switzerland with Germany. They don't want to do that. Why? There's lots and lots of French defenses along the border. And in fact, on the other side of the border, the Germans have their own defenses. As a result, if the Germans had invaded there, number one, the French would expect it, and they would have lots of good defenses there. And number two, it would be really hard to maneuver, because they'd have to take out fortress after fortress after fortress, at defensible positions as well. So the Germans didn't want to have to deal with that. So every army doesn't want to have to fight the enemy standing if they don't have to. The German original plan was to go through the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg, where there's not many fortresses, not many prepared positions for defensive purposes. There's none of that. So the Germans' plan is to move through the open territory of Belgium and Luxembourg, move through the soft underbelly of the French border. And the plan here is that they would wheel through Belgium and Luxembourg, make their way into France, and wheel around Paris, and then encircle the French army somewhere around here. Somewhere there. So the plan is to invade through Belgium and Luxembourg. The original plan includes Netherlands, but they kicked it out, so they keep the Netherlands as an open port and a neutral. Now, the German reason for doing this is twofold. The first reason why they're doing this is because there's not many, fortresses or, fortifications blocking the Germans. So they could basically move through with ease. And if you look at Belgium, especially, other than the Meuse River, there's not many real rivers here, is there? Just look at this, the area here. You can move your way through. There's a lot of rivers in France, but not necessarily in Belgium in the area that they're talking about. Same thing with Luxembourg. So, the German plan is to surround the entire French army in a massive encirclement battle of somewhere between, Reims and Nancy. This whole area here is where they want to surround it. Once they surround the French army, in basically 2 to 4, maybe 5 months, they could shift their entire army from here, shift it to fight the Russians and defeat them. So the German plan is to invade France, surround the French army, defeat the French army as fast as possible, and then shift all the resources over to Russia and fight them at will. Probably also with the Austrians in tow. The Germans also knew invading Belgium would bring the British into the war. They knew that. The problem here is that in 1914 the British really wouldn't matter. The British army was small, the navy was formidable, but the army was pretty small, and that was the problem for the British. The Germans realized that at best there's going to be maybe an expeditionary force, and they're not going to last long in the battlefield. That's what the Germans realized pretty quickly. So it helps as well the Germans have a massive rail network. If you look at the rail network in this picture here, and you combine it with the Schlieffen plan, the Germans are thinking, and Alfred von Schlieffen is thinking in terms of technical terms. Alfred von Schlieffen is thinking in terms of, when he first wrote the plan, the Russians had just lost the Russo-Japanese War in 1904 1905. They just lost it. He's very ambivalent about the Russians. So he's going to put most of the German forces against France. And this is important for a few reasons. Number one, what he wants to do is figure out how fast a soldier can walk from point A to point B with XYZ amount of gear. They can walk X amount of miles, cool. In X amount of hours, great. So he's trying to think of warfare as not only an art, but also a science. So his goal is to mobilize the German forces and send it to the German border as fast as possible, and send them into Belgium, Luxembourg, and France as fast as possible. As he's going to use railway timetables, he's going to use movement timetables to really game out what the German army can do. Now, Schlieffen is smart. He says his army could make it in. He could probably make it somewhere between the Somme River and the Marne. He didn't say how far it can get in. He knew it can get into France. He could see them making it to Amiens. He could see them making it to Reims and Verdun. But beyond that, his notes essentially fail. But he's going to put them in the best position because he's going to mobilize and use the rail networks to deploy them, supply them, and keep supplying them. So even though the German army might move forward, there's lots of resources behind it still moving in. But Germany also is fighting this war as part of a coalition. So you have the Central Powers. And the plan here is for Germany is, one, for the Austrians to fight the Russians as best they can. That's their plan. If the Germans could have the Austrians hold off the Russians, great. And then, after defeating France, the Germans would shift their operations eastward, and the Germans and Austrians would defeat the Russians. It was assumed and hoped that the Austrian army, which is actually a pretty good army, in 1914, it's actually a pretty good army, it was hoped that the Austrians would be able to hold out against the Russians, and at least fight them to a draw. The Germans also anticipated the Russians taking weeks to mobilize. Now, a few things of note with the maps here as well is that it's really just Germany, Austria I'm talking about right now. Italy is not going to join World War I until basically 1915. And they're going to join the other side. They're not going to stay in the Central Powers. They're going to join France, Russia, and Britain. So, and the Italians go to the highest bidder, and they're immaterial to the 1914 plans anyway. Although I would have liked to have, in the counterfactual, seen the Italians support the Germans instead. It would have made more sense. But that being said, you have competing alliances. On one side, Germany, Austria, they're the Central Powers. On the other side, they have l'Entente Cordiale. The Entente, which includes France, Russia, and then eventually Britain when Germany invades Belgium. Now, the Entente is a memorandum of understanding. What it really means is that they're essentially all associated powers to each other, and they're essentially friendly to each other and willing to support each other in war if need be. That's essentially what it means. But the Germans are planning on using Austria to hold the Russians off as much as possible and fight their battle in France, ignore the British in 1914, and then fight the Russians after winning in France. That's their plan. And it's supposed to be a fast invasion. The Germans are thinking about moving from the German border all the way to Paris in the span of basically a month to a month and a half. So they're asking a lot of their soldiers. But the smart thing is that they're going to use mobile artillery and fast-moving infantry to do so. Now, the reasoning that the Germans operate this way and why their army is so good is they're basically the only army thinking about modern warfare going into 1914. The British and French and even the Russians are thinking of imperial wars where they're fighting back against local indigenous peoples, typically speaking. The Boer War is an example of not local for all intents and purposes. But they're fighting local peoples, and it's really easy to beat them. So their battle history since the basically 1860s, with Britain and France especially, is mostly against enemies who really can't fight back. The Germans are thinking about a modern war in Europe, though. So their plan is infantry would move forward. The infantry would move forward, and the infantry would stop the enemy, or fix them. Now, if the infantry on their own could flank them, great. But the real reasoning for the infantry is that they would fix the enemy position, force the enemy to fight, basically in either dug in or force them to fight in the open. And the Germans would either use their artillery to A, smash the enemies and with direct fire, or B, outflank them using artillery and hit them from an open end. So the German plan essentially involved a lot of flanking and a lot of artillery. So at the top we see, and these are field artillery. These are used in battle essentially. Sometimes they're used against big targets like fortresses. They will be at Liège and Namur in 1914. But beyond that, they're very big guns, and that could be used to smash major enemy units. So at the top we have a 21 CM Morser. It's obviously a huge gun. And at the bottom we have the M. Garrett Big Bertha type guns. So these are major guns that are able to do a lot of not only damage, but they are going to be moved forward in the battlefield. A lot of these guns could be disassembled and then reassembled as need be. But that being said, the German army is going to be a very modern army, thinking about artillery and thinking about destructive force of them. The direct fire or the plunging fire from artillery would be able to, and this is modern tools. We're no longer using cannonballs, so we're using canister, we're using shot, and have-not, whatnot. So the hope is that either directly or indirectly, artillery will smash enemy units in full. Basically, rather than take out individual soldiers, the purpose of the heavy artillery was not only take out fortresses, but as essentially almost wonder weapons in World War I to cause massive damage to the enemy from the air. And so it's hard for the cavalry to operate in this environment, and infantry units basically operating in the open or being flanked by artillery would just get destroyed. Anyway, I'm going to stop over here because this is the German army getting into World War I. This is what getting into World War I. In the following video, we're going to discuss what happens when the German army actually activates in World War I and moves forward. We'll see the Schlieffen Plan in action, and we'll see why it ultimately failed. But that's for the next video. I will see you soon.